I deliberately gave these workshops half-hour buffers. The lectures are continuous, nonstop until somebody drops dead, but the workshops have a half-hour buffer. So you're going to get full Bruce here, no problem. You're encouraged to ask questions and get involved. Say, what's that slide? What's going on there? Lectures are different, so get engaged. Take advantage of your opportunity with Bruce. Now, there are a handful of researchers in this field who have what we call chops. Okay. Not simply because they do high-level work, but because they've been doing it for a long time. This man does his work so well that the naval laboratories allow him to continue to work for them and pay him a reasonable life and a check every couple of weeks, even though he's examining UFO phenomena. What does it mean? It means that if you don't rock the boat and you conduct yourself in a high degree, the government is okay with that, because the government knows there's extraterrestrials. Half of the government, based on the polls alone, know there's extraterrestrials. They're just not going around talking about it in the news. Because there's a game going on. It's a charade. It's a thing. It's a whatever you want to call it. It's had its run. It's time for it to stop. One of the people that's going to help it stop is Bruce Maccabee, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who has been doing raw research on sightings and photographs, the stuff that, Phil Klass demanded that we do. Investigate. We must have tangible stuff. Look at that's what he does. Been doing it for a long time. But he's not going to stop there. He got interested in, like many others, the political side, the government side, because that's where it's going to happen, folks. Unless those guys come down here, park 50 ships on the ellipse, it's not going to be some hot photograph. It's not going to be some super video. Ooh, look what I got. And they go, okay, you got us. It's going to be a political, it's going to be a political resolved issue. That's why Bruce got into the issue of government documents and the FBI, produced a very important book, UFO FBI Connection, and that's the definite reason why he's here, because that's the X conference. So thank you so much for coming to the workshop for Bruce. I'm going to let him take over. Thank you.
Thank you.
You okay?
Are you okay? Just remember, no panic, no fun. Okay, now I have a lecture here that consists of over 100 slides and that I'm supposed to talk about in 90 minutes. However, many of them are just words. You'll be able to read them as fast as I can speak them, or maybe even faster. So if you have questions, go ahead and feel free to ask them, but I would like to be able to try to get to the end, because really the punchline is at the very end. This is a history starting in 1947 and going up through 1952 and early 1953. And when you see what happened, that nobody could have put the story together 50 years ago, because nobody had access to all the records that we have now. And you'll see why that is true. Well, anyway, I call this 1952 the year of the UFO, and we're stuck in the legacy of the year of 1952. It's so important you could write a song about it. When I was 10 years old, let's see now if I get this thing to work here. When I was 10 years old, it was a very good year for saucers flying through the sky. And the Air Force asked why, and so do I. This is the year that the Air Force established a tradition that there is nothing to UFOs. Come on. To understand what happened in 1952, you have to use historical records, which many of which have just become available within the last 25 or so years. Records from the projects, the Air Force project Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book, Office of Special Investigations, the Office of Intelligence of the Air Force, the FBI, and the CIA. Now, if anybody doesn't understand this stuff, please, raise your hand right away, because we're talking about the sources of the intelligence sources of information for which this talk is based. Now, how many people here are familiar with what happened in 1947? Okay, so I'm going to give you a background history lesson, because you have to know what leads up to 1952 to understand the significance. In early 1947, we started having sporadic sightings, but nobody was reporting them to anyone else. It wasn't until June of 1947 when Kenneth Arnold, I'll talk about a little later, had his sighting. that got publicized, that all of a sudden everybody was galvanized into, oh, look, something's going on, and then the Air Force began collecting information. And June and August of 1947 was the first big flap. Nobody knows exactly how many sightings there were. There have been over 1,000 newspaper reports identified, and these would be situations where people call up the newspaper and then gave a description of a sighting. Anyway, the government denies knowledge. Sounds just like it's right out of the X-Files, right? Air Force became involved almost immediately. There was a controversy over the cause of the sightings. Theories range from Soviet to U.S. and natural phenomena. There was hardly any mention. There was hardly any mention of ET. And after the summer of 1947, sightings continued, although it tended to fade out of the news media. The sighting that galvanized everybody was this Kenneth Arnold sighting, an experienced pilot, June 24th, 1947. He was flying, as this shows on that dashed line down there past. He was flying over here where this airplane is, heading east, and he saw these 9 objects, semicircular, flying southward past Mount Rainier and then down past Mount Adams. It was about 50 miles. He timed it with a clock on his dashboard, 102 seconds. It came out to 1,700 miles an hour. He couldn't believe that it was that high. He did some recalculation and trying to make it as imprecise as possible and still came up with 1,200 miles an hour. Interestingly, down at the bottom here, down at Mount Adams, there was a prospector. Most people don't know it, but there was a second witness to the things that Arnold saw. This is what he described in his letter to the Air Force. Arnold wrote a letter to the Air Force a couple of weeks after his sighting made it into the newspapers. Immediately following Arnold's sighting, there was a prospector by the name of Fred Johnson near Mount Adams who saw the object close up. Johnson reported that his compass needle wobbled. This is the first electromagnetic effect report. Johnson was interviewed by the FBI and found credible. And his is the first unexplained sighting in the Project Blue Book file of 13,000 sightings. Kenneth Arnold's is not the first. Why? Because the Air Force claims that Kenneth Arnold saw a mirage. Mirage makes no sense at all, by the way, in the context of Kenneth Arnold's sighting. So anyway, during 1947, the Air Force collected only about 24 sightings for analysis out of estimated several thousand that were reported in newspapers. Many of the witnesses were Air Force personnel on duty. On July 8th, there was a major sighting at Edwards Air Force Base, or Muroc Air Force Base in those days. On July 10th, the Air Force asked the FBI to enter the fray. The FBI investigated for about 2 months, found no evidence of communist subversion. That was the reason given by the Air Force was we want the FBI to get in because there's a possibility that some subversive people are generating spurious reports in order to make the American people less confident of the ability of the Air Force to control the skies. So the FBI investigated and found no subversive people. Instead, they found generally credible witnesses. This established, the most important fact about this is it established a continuing link between the Air Force and the FBI. And the FBI got that information from the Air Force, as you will see later on, that no one else got. At the end of the summer of 1947, the Air Force had already collected a couple of dozen sightings and analyzed them carefully and decided something was going on. General Twining, who was the head of the Air Materiel Command at the time where a lot of this analysis was going on, wrote a letter that basically summarized the situation. He said UFOs are real and not visionary or fictitious, and we ought to set up a project to study the situation. Then General Shulgin, who was in the Pentagon, who had actually asked Twining for an opinion on what was going on, General Shulgin generated a document called The Essential Elements of Information based on characteristics of objects. This is what he was sending out to intelligence agents in the United States and out throughout the world, saying, look for information on objects, devices, flying objects that have these characteristics: flat bottom, absence of sound, extreme maneuverability, oval or disc-shaped, ability to quickly disappear by high speed or disintegration. Now that's a really interesting characteristic, you see, that they had already discovered about these flying saucers. They could move so fast, or something rather, they would appear to just disintegrate. Ability to appear suddenly, evasive action observed. So we're asking for, what it amounts to is this document shows that the Air Force, as early as the late summer of 1947, had a pretty good idea of the extreme characteristics of flying saucers. and they were asking their agents to find out, could there be some technological development in some country somewhere that could account for these objects. Of course, they never found any information that would correspond to those objects being made by any country in the world. General Twining's recommendation for setting up a project was accepted. That became Project Sign that started in early 1948. During 1948, they analyzed 270-some sighting reports. In the late summer of 1948, the Project Sign investigators concluded the only logical explanation was interplanetary. They sent what was called the estimate of the situation up through the chain of command to General Vandenberg, and he said, sorry, wrong answer, not sufficient proof. But the main important fact is, these were the experts in aeronautical back engineering. If you had found a Russian MiG or something, you'd send it to the people at the Air Materiel Command to find out how it worked. These guys were the experts. The general up at the top says, sorry, wrong answer. So he basically was countering his own experts. Sign closed at the end of 1948, and then Project Grudge begins. Now, when Project Grudge began, because of the rejection of the interplanetary explanation, analysts had to reduce the importance of careful analysis to fit each report into one of the following categories of explanation. In other words, explanation became the rule of the day. Any way at all, any explanation in a storm. Misidentification, hoax, delusion, advanced Soviet aircraft, our secret aircraft, with allowable explanations. ET was no longer allowable. And Grudge was a low-level effort, studied only a couple of hundred sightings of the 400 available by the end of Project Grudge in December 1949, announced publicly that all sightings had been explained and the Project Grudge was closed and the Air Force wasn't interested anymore. That was a lie. Project Grudge continued at a low level, and in fact, the people, the staff of Project Grudge, were doing the best they could to explain everything one way or another. In September 1951, as a result of radar and visual sightings at Fort Monmouth, General Cabell, who was the director of the Air Force Intelligence, found out that Project Grudge was not treating the stuff seriously after all, and that made him angry. Furthermore, he made a comment in a private meeting that we have notes on thanks to Captain Edward Ruppelt. Apparently, Cabell called the Grudge report of December 1949 worthless tripe. In other words, the general knew more than the guys who wrote the report, I guess. He knew more about us being a bunch of garbage. General Cabell demanded a reorganization and upgrading, and then in November of 1951, General John Samford became the director of the Air Force Intelligence. And so now, this is an extremely brief history of stuff that you could spend a whole hour on talking just about, what happened between 47 and 52. But that gives you a background. There had been hundreds of sightings that the Air Force had collected by that time. I should point out there probably were thousands of sightings by that time and reported in newspapers, but the Air Force wasn't getting everything. And this does tend to be Air Force oriented because there weren't any civilian organizations that were very active at that point. So the whole story of collection and analysis really what amounted to what was the Air Force was doing. So anyway, in early 1952, the name was changed to Project Blue Book, and the project was reorganized under Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. How many people here have read Ruppelt's book? The report on unidentified flying objects is sort of like required reading if you're going to be seriously investigating UFOs, because this was written by a guy who was there at the time. We now know more than he did, but we haven't found him wrong on anything. In 1955, he published a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Okay, the beginning of the year 1952, General Garland, who was working for General Samford, wrote a memorandum entitled Contemplated Action to Determine the Nature and Origin of Phenomena Connected with Reports of Unusual Flying Objects. Since 1947, they have been saying we got to get better information, and here it is, January of 1952, and they're saying the same thing. Reports of unusual objects are continuing. Methods of study used thus far are inconclusive. Neither positive nor negative proof. Now, I emphasize nor negative because as far as the public was concerned, the Air Force was continually saying, we've explained it all. We've proven there's nothing there. Nothing has turned up that looked like a technological surprise. Neither positive nor negative proof. And we need positive action to identify the nature and the origin. So here they're admitting, once again, on the inside, that they don't know what's going on. This memo shows that despite public statements to the contrary, the Air Force was concerned over the situation and had unexplained sightings. Now, Garland wrote his memo appealing to the Soviet threat. He says it's logical to relate these to the USSR advances based on German war research. And you find this throughout the early history of the Air Force investigation, that they appealed to the Soviet threat to justify things, just to justify investigation. He made what were considered to be outlandish suggestions to the Air Force, that the Soviet Union was 10 years ahead of us in aeronautical development, that they had, and he points out that he's worried that we have a good atomic bomb, but only dumpy old airplanes to carry them. If the Soviets are flying these flying saucers around, they may have a crummy atomic bomb, but they have a tremendous device for transporting it. So if they should happen to get a good atomic bomb and add it to their flying saucers, then we're wiped out. That's what he's just basically arguing in this as a justification for, you're making this argument as a justification for continuing investigation of flying saucers. If the USSR gets both the carrier and the saucers, it's going to be tough for us. He recommended that the Air Defense Command should increase its effort to obtain photographs and radar detection. And so you could ask the question, didn't Garland know the Soviet threat was bogus? It was bogus. The idea that the Soviet craft had been rejected by sign and grudge in years past. Did General Garland use the Soviet threat to cover up the real reason for ordering an increased effort? According to Ruppelt, Garland was a UFO witness. Garland's memorandum shows that at high levels the Air Force intelligence took the UFO problem seriously, even though the Air Force publicly disparaged the subject. Shows the top Air Force intelligence didn't want to contradict General Vandenberg by suggesting the interplanetary possibility might be a reason. So in other words, he wasn't justifying it from these might be flying craft from another planet. He said they might be Soviet. Ruppelt and the Project Blue Book staff carried out Garland's order, but it required many months, and the big flap was over by the time they were actually prepared to handle a few sightings per month. So this is the calm before the storm now. Between early January and early April 1952, things were quiet while Project Blue Book reorganized. Reports continued at a low rate from the previous year. This is based on a scientific study of UFOs, the Conan Report, and SR 14 refers to Special Report 14 that was done by the Battelle Memorial Institute, published in 1955. Here you look at the sighting rate. 1951, January through December. This is month by month, 25, 18, 13, 6, 5, 6, 10, 18, so on. Average 14 a month in 1951. 1952, January 15, February 18, March 27th. So things are going along famously. About a sighting every day or every other day. Then the storm begins. In early April, a magazine article almost blew the lid off the cover-up of the high-level Air Force opinion on UFOs. In the following weeks, everything broke loose. And now if you can get your eyes off of Maryland and look in the upper right-hand corner, this is Life magazine, April 7th, 1952. There is a case for interplanetary saucers, and incidentally, I got my copy of this out of the FBI file. And yes, there's an FBI file on Maryland, too. There's an FBI file on almost everybody, so you can look here and see if you got one yourself. It's all on the internet now, folks. Okay, so Life says there is a case for interplanetary saucers. They must be crazy. Anyways, based on a year investigation that included interviews with top Air Force officials, and the article concluded the Air Force is now ready to concede. Remember all the newspapers that I haven't had a chance to go into, all the stories by the press on what the Air Force was doing. The Air Force was saying there's nothing to it, and we're not interested. All of a sudden in this Life magazine, the Air Force is now ready to concede that many saucer and fireball sightings, I haven't got time to talk about that, but if you go to my lecture on the FBI, UFO FBI lecture tomorrow, you'll hear about the fireball stuff, green fireballs. Anyway, they defy explanation. Here, Life offers some scientific evidence that there is a real case for interplanetary saucers. 10 previously unpublished sightings were studied. Conclusion, not explainable as Russian weapons, atmospheric phenomena, skyhook balloons, hallucinations, and so on. These disclosures, sharply amending past Air Force policy, climaxed a review by Life with Air Force officials of all the facts known. The Air Force is now ready to concede that many saucer and fireball sightings still defy explanation. The article quoted from Dr. Walter Riedel, who was a German rocket scientist, these objects have an out-of-this-world basis. They quoted an Air Force intelligence officer who said, "The higher you go in the Air Force, the more seriously they take flying saucers." That could have been Ruppelt, but it wasn't. The name of whoever said that wasn't given. The article ended with a series of questions which pointed towards the interplanetary answer. What power urges them at such terrible speeds through the sky? Who or what is aboard? Where do they come from? Why are they here? What are the intentions of the beings who control them? Somewhere in the dark skies, there may be those who know. The answer is out there. The Project Blue Book response to the Life article. Now, this is the internal memorandum by Project Blue Book, writing themselves. Ruppelt wrote, "It should be noted here that the conclusions reached by Life are not those of the Air Force. No proof exists that these objects are from outer space." He wrote in his 1956 book, "Some high-ranking officers in the Pentagon, so high that their personal opinion was almost policy, did believe the saucers were extraterrestrial and expressed that opinion to Jinnah," one of the writers of the article. And Ruppelt says, General Garland, in his private notes, Ruppelt says, "General Garland was the inspiration behind the Life article by Jinnah. He gave Jinnah his ideas and prompted Life to stick their necks out." Remember, he said that Ruppelt claimed that Garland was a UFO witness. When you become a witness, you're more likely to stick your neck out. The reaction. According to the Project Blue Book file, the Life article was mentioned in more than 350 newspapers. The Life article was ridiculed in the New York Times and disputed elsewhere, and they appealed to the Grudge Report, which had said there was nothing to it and all the sightings were explained. Remember, that's the report that General Cabell said was tripe. Air Technical Intelligence received 110 letters concerning the article. Life itself received more than 700 letters over the next few weeks, and unfortunately, Life threw those away. Most of them were about old sightings. The Project Blue Book staff expected an immediate onslaught of new sightings, but it didn't come, at least not for several weeks. Now what? I bet you I know. Okay, so now we've been having 14 a month in 1951 and 52. What this is an attempt, this is sort of what Project Blue Book was aware of at the time it was occurring. In January, they had collected 10 reports, February 19, March 17, April 91. What I refer on the right-hand side there is objects sighted. So in other words, these are the actual reports, and here's the number of objects that were supposedly seen, according to this study called Special Report 14. Anyway, notice that in April, all of a sudden you jump to 91 reports, May 70 reports, June 111. This is a big jump from the 14 per month that they had been having. It went up by a factor of 10 almost. Project Blue Book staff believe the jump in the sighting rate was caused by the Life article. The increase began in Canada and moved into the USA during June, and including sightings by the military in Korea, not likely a result of the Life article. So in June of 1952, because of the lag in reporting, Project Blue Book was only aware of 111. In the following months, they collected more reports. You remember, there's a time delay between when somebody sees something and when a report actually gets to Project Blue Book. So it was 176 is the number of reports received total in June, corresponding to 148 objects. The sighting rate was several per day, and then the deluge began. As if that weren't bad enough, several per day. Then things really got tough. By the end of July, you were getting as many as 20 reports a day. The Project Blue Book, reorganized, could have handled several a day. Project Blue Book, reorganized, could not handle the actual sighting rate in July. In July, they had 782 reports that corresponded to 536 objects. And reports were coming from everywhere. It's a UFO geography lesson. New Jersey, Michigan, California, Florida, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New Hampshire, Maryland, Germany. You can see the numbers there. 51 sightings reported in 24 states and the District of Columbia. 14 of these are by military observers, of which 6 were at Air Force bases. Flying saucer sightings at Air Force bases, don't tell anybody about that. And if you see one, don't look. What was going on? Were people going crazy? Well, the press, of course, was getting reports. People were and the press interest was building up on this, but the press really woke up in July Associated Press, Dateline, Ohio, the home of Project Blue Book, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, July 17th. An Air Force spokesman said today, 60 reports of flying saucers have been received during the last 2 weeks. He could give no reason for the increase. Now here are some nice little newspaper articles, and if you get the CD that I have available that covers this and some other stuff that I mentioned earlier, covers this talk and the FBI talk and so on, the CD, you'll actually be able to read these newspaper articles. Here we have Abilene, Texas, July 23rd, Abilene family sights mysterious object. Bartow, Florida, saucers get closer to Bartow. Santa Ana, California, registered July 22, flying saucer tracked over Cleveland Field, and so on. Washington, D.C., Daily News, July 18th, the saucers keep coming. A WRC radio engineer sees 5 orange discs. Air Force admits that saucers have been tracked on radar between 1,500 and 2,000 miles an hour. Jet fighters equipped with very latest radar have been set aloft to make contact with the phantom objects. But all efforts to catch have failed. All efforts to catch up with them have failed. July 18th, Chicago Daily News. A lieutenant colonel in the Civil Air Patrol says he saw an object last week and believes they are not natural. July 19th, Washington Daily News. Civil Defense Director at Dayton, Ohio says there is something flying around our skies and I wish we knew what it is. July 19th, in a national press story, the Air Force admits people are really seeing something unusual. The number of reports has doubled. The Air Force can't track all the saucers. And then things really got hot. As if that weren't bad enough, right over Washington, D.C. on July 19th, Washington National Airport radar detected strong targets. At 12:05 p.m., that should be a.m., I guess. It should be a.m., not p.m. It's supposed to be nighttime, you get the impression. Orange ball of fire sighted at Andrews Air Force Base. During the next 2.5 hours, there were several visual sightings, including a commercial airplane pilot report in the D.C. vicinity. Fast moving lights like nothing I had never seen before. Was Project Blue Book on the ball, or are they asleep at the switch? Captain Ruppelt and Project Blue Book learned of the Washington, D.C. radar and visual sightings from a newspaper story. He happened to be in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. This happened on Saturday night and Sunday. He happened to be in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, and he reads a newspaper about what happened. You know, this just shows you how the low priority that Project Blue Book was running at. They didn't have good information sources. Anyway, not only does he find out about it in the newspaper, he finds out through the chain of command that the president wants a briefing. Now, what's going on? What's happening? And Ruppelt didn't know what was going on, and he had no answer for Truman, and he told the press no comment, which the press probably took to mean that, well, we know what's going on, but we're not telling anybody. Anyway, was Washington, D.C. ground zero for UFOs? On July 25th, this is a week later, Saturday night, 9:15 p.m., 4 to 8 radar targets in the D.C. vicinity, described by radar operators as good, sharp targets. The UFO and one F-94 were observed on a radar scope and appeared to be traveling in the same approximate speed. Is this working? Come on. Well, we had that one before. Where's the next one? There. Okay, so the press was filled with saucer reports. Late July, the newspapers throughout the country saturated with sightings. July 28th, Indianapolis News, front page headline, hundreds in state see flying saucers. This was a big headline. The story reported that military personnel and police officers kept a running check on saucers for more than 4 hours. Come on. Well. I don't know whether this system doesn't load up the pictures fast enough. We saw that. Okay, here's the pictures themselves. Saucers circle Washington, D.C. is in a Southbridge, Mass. newspaper, a Massachusetts newspaper reporting what happened in Washington, D.C. Alert jets to hunt the saucers. Hundreds in state see the flying saucers. The Air Force reacts, you know, shoot first, ask questions later. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Air Force alerts jets to chase flying saucers anywhere in the U.S. July 28th, International News Service. Jet pilots have been placed on 24-hour alert against flying saucers with order to shoot them down if they refuse to land. But they never got any. Here's some more newspaper reports. The longest day. Subsequent analysis showed there were 43 sightings on July 28th. However, because of the lag in reporting of the sightings, the staff was not fully aware of that sighting rate. According to the newspaper article published in August 1, Project Blue Book was aware of only 114 of the over 500 sightings that occurred during July. They thought 114 was bad. Eventually, they realized what really happened. What might the Project Blue Book staff have been thinking? Was a war of worlds about to begin? On July 29th, the Associated Press headline, "Whatever they are, flying saucers put in the busiest week on record." In the New York area, in Washington, D.C., New England, Ohio, West Virginia, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and France, reports came in of strange aerial objects that defied immediate explanation. The Air Force said the volume of such reports was the heaviest it has been in 5 years. Most of the sightings were made by relatively competent observers, by pilots, airport control tower men, and civilian Air Force defense spotters. Now, relatively competent. You know, the Air Force was trying to argue that only nuts and crackpots report flying saucers. The Air Force says there's still no concrete evidence to prove or disprove the so-called flying saucers. The question is, with all this smoke, was there no fire? What must the top Air Force generals have been thinking? They were thinking it's time for a press conference. The Air Force reacts. Press conference. July 29, Pentagon, one of the largest and longest press conferences since the end of World War II, has nothing to do with the Korean War, which, you know, I haven't got time to go into the background of what was happening in the rest of the world, but the Korean War was going on. General Samford, the director of the Air Force Intelligence, presented a prepared statement and then took questions from the press. There's the man who's the voice of reason right there, General John A. Samford. I met his son one time. His son didn't know any more than I do. His father never talked. We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able to adequately explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by, sorry, I can't verbalize this in red, but you can see, credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we are now attempting to resolve. We have, as of this date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate to any conceivable threat to the United States. And then the press conference went on for another 80 minutes. The backstory to the press conference, and by the way, you'll see a little bit more of it in my UFO FBI talk tomorrow. On July 24th, Samford had asked Lieutenant Colonel Smith to write a memorandum for presentation on July 29th to a General White of the Air Force Operations. That memorandum became what General Samford told the press, between 1,000 and 1,050 reports since 1947. Samford said between 1,000 and 2,000. Recent sightings attributed to the Life magazine article, according to this memorandum written by Lieutenant Colonel White, or Colonel Smith. Colonel Smith's memorandum continued, there is no significance attached to the location of the sightings other than that they are random in nature. 180 unexplained sightings out of the 1,000, 180 unexplained, only 53 of which come from what are considered reliable sources. This is about 5%. Well, guess what? The canonical number for the percentage of unexplained after you do all sorts of investigation turns out to be about 5 to 10%. So in other words, a lot of UFO reports, flying saucer reports, turn out to be explainable. Not surprising. The fact that there's a large percentage of 5 to 10%. One would be enough. We're talking about 53 sightings which came from reliable sources. 20% unexplained, and a quarter of the unexplained are what I call the hardcore. At the press conference, the Air Force basically admitted that 20% of the cases were unexplained. Claimed radar targets were a result of atmospheric inversion caused by summer heating. So in other words, what was seen over Washington, D.C. was a result of the weather. Visual sightings and visual radar combined were not discussed. There was no evidence of threat to the United States, admitted that 20% of the sightings had not been explained, rejected interplanetary theory, and expressed the opinion, this is Samford, expressed the opinion that unexplained sightings result from natural phenomena. The CIA has monitored since 1949 at a very low level. As a result of recent events, a group has been formed to study the situation. Clark requested an overall evaluation, this guy, Ralph Clark. On August 1, Dr. Edward Taus responded to the request for the evaluation based on Project Blue Book information. There are only about 100 reports not explained, he said. These probably are explainable if more information were available. There's no discernible pattern. That, by the way, was another thing that Blue Book was often do. They say, well, we have these unexplained cases, but if we had more information about them, we could explain them too. But of course, when you really carefully analyze the situation, you realize that the unexplained cases, the hardcore, could not be explained, not because there was insufficient information, but because there was so much information that was unexplainable that you had to imagine that people went wacko and then returned to normalcy, cameras went wacko and returned to normalcy immediately afterward. You know, it was beyond the pale of reason. Anyway, Dr. Taus added a cautionary note which formed the basis for continued CIA involvement. Notwithstanding the foregoing tentative facts, so long as a series of reports remained unexplainable, interplanetary aspects and alien origin not being thoroughly excluded from consideration, caution requires that intelligence continue coverage of the situation. So this is a reasonable point of view for a guy to take who's never been in this before. He goes and talks about Cox of the Air Force. He's aware of what's been going on in the press and so on. And he says, well, we can't, he's allowing for the possibility of interplanetary even though the Air Force rules it out. Taus recommended that no indication of CIA interest or concern reach the press or public in view of their probable alarmist tendencies to accept such interest as confirmatory of the soundness of unpublished facts in the hands of the U.S. government. So he's saying, we're going to do some stuff in the CIA, but we're not going to tell anybody about it. We're not going to tell the public anyway. They checked with the Research and Development Board at the top secret level. No secret project explained saucer sightings, and it reiterated what the Air Force had told the FBI in 1947. The CIA representatives visited the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The Air Technical Intelligence Center was Project Blue Book was part of that, and interviewed the Project Blue Book staff, Ruppelt and so on. This was part of part of the CIA's investigation of what the Air Force was doing. They went to the Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and interviewed the people. On August 20th, the Director of Central Intelligence, Walter B. Smith, was briefed on the saucer situation, and the Air Force stand on flying saucers as stated by the CIA. That's the title of the briefing. Air Force stand on flying saucers as stated by the CIA. In other words, the CIA has gone and interviewed the Air Force. Now this is what the CIA thinks the Air Force is saying. Air Force Project Blue Book has primary responsibility for investigation. Project Blue Book consists of 3 officers, a captain and 2 civilians. So it's not a large organization to handle hundreds of sightings. Project Blue Book receives reports of sightings, analyzes, and attempts to explain them. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, that's AFOSI, checks into each sighting, attempting to determine its authenticity and the reliability of the observer. Continuing with the CIA document that says Air Force opinion of the saucers is determined by as is understood by the CIA. Air Force officially denies the flying saucers are secret weapons, Soviet secret weapons, our secret weapons, their secret weapons, or extraterrestrial visitors. The Air Force believes that all sightings of flying saucers are well-known objects, such as that list there, phenomena of the atmosphere which are not presently understood, and so on. And there is not a shred of evidence that exists to substantiate the belief that flying saucers are material objects not falling into the category 2B above, which is this well-known objects or phenomena of the atmosphere. Continuing, the geographical distribution more frequent in the vicinity of atomic energy installations, which is explained by the greater security consciousness of persons in those areas. Byproducts of atomic fission may in some way produce flying saucers. So they're really grasping at straws here, but they're trying to think of some reason why these things should be suddenly appearing, and maybe atomic energy could explain it. Of the thousands of flying saucers cited, of which there are records, the Air Force says that 78% have been explained by either the B1 or B2, that is, man-made objects or natural phenomena above. 2% have been exposed as hoaxes, and the remaining 20% have not been explained, primarily because of vague descriptions given by the observers. So here the Air Force is telling the CIA that we have offered reasonable explanations for most sightings. There are a few hoaxes, and the ones we can't explain is because they're from poor observers. That contradicts what Samford had said. He said the credible sightings, I forget the exact phrase, unusual sightings by credible people. The Air Force was mostly interested in saucers because of its psychological warfare implications. Not a single Soviet reference to flying saucers. In USA, several saucer societies have been investigated. Key members of some of these societies have kept the flying saucer craze before the public. Some key members have been exposed as being of doubtful loyalty, some societies financed by unknown source, and so on. There's a lot of paranoia going on here. Anyway, Project Blue Book presented the official version of the possible flying saucer explanations, which does not include the ET. No, ET had been rejected as an acceptable explanation, as I told you earlier, when General Hoyt Vandenberg knocked down the estimate of the situation in 1947. So the Project Blue Book could not use ET as a potential explanation. They had to fit it into something else. And that's what they told the CIA. They told the CIA it had to be natural phenomena, man-made, or hoaxes or delusions. I wonder what the CIA might have been told if they had gone to General Samford's office in the Pentagon instead of Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Would they have been told by Samford's staff in the Pentagon that interplanetary was being considered? But instead, they went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where Project Blue Book was running, and Project Blue Book were low-level guys, and they were the guys who were having this pressure down from above. You can't use ET as a possible explanation. It has to be fitted into everything else. So they're told the party line of Project Blue Book in the summer of 1952. What? There is no memorandum written that says you cannot include ET. But when they tried out the ET explanation in the summer of 1947 and they sent this up to General Vandenberg, he said, I won't accept that. And then as Ruppelt put it in his book, after that, during Project Grudge, for example, there were no feathers in the caps for cases that were unexplained. If you wanted an advancement or whatever, you want to have brownie points, you explained the sightings. One way or another, even if it didn't make any logical sense. So anyway, the CIA says the Office of Scientific Intelligence entered into its inquiry fully aware it was coming into a field already charged with partisanship, one in which objectivity had been overridden by numerous sensational writers, and one in which there are pressures for extravagant explanation, as well as for oversimplification. So he's allowing for the possibility, well, Project Blue Book might be wrong, maybe something really is going on here. The Office of Scientific Intelligence team consulted with a representative of the Air Force Special Studies Group. This was Passoni. And by the way, I didn't get a chance to mention that Passoni had a document which for some reason or other didn't come up on this presentation, written back in April of 1952, which Passoni said the Air Force cannot assume that flying saucers are interplanetary. This is embedded in a document, and it's written in a context that he's trying to argue against it. He says the Air Force cannot assume that flying saucers are interplanetary. That, in the context, suggests that there's somebody in the Air Force who assumes they're flying, there's nothing we can do about it. That could explain why the top level of the Air Force didn't have a tremendous amount of pressure to get information on flying saucers. If they knew they were interplanetary, they couldn't do anything about them. May as well spend our money where we can do something instead of chasing flying saucers. Anyway, this lists what the CIA was doing. They were trying to do a good investigation of what the Air Force had done. And the Office of Scientific Intelligence found Project Blue Book analysis is probably valid if all one wanted to do was a case-by-case explanation. Project Blue Book makes no attempt to solve the more fundamental aspect of the problem. Why do we have the sightings? And to discover means by which these causes and their visual or electronic effects may be immediately identified. Why do the sightings appear? Why do these things appear? And why can't we explain them immediately? They thought maybe explanations probably lie just beyond the frontiers of our present knowledge in the fields of atmospheric, ionospheric, and extraterrestrial phenomena, with the added possibility that our present dispersal of nuclear waste products might also be a factor. So they're grasping at straws to find out some explanation for these sightings. They were worried about psychological warfare. the Soviet Union generating a whole bunch of sightings at the time that they wanted to attack, causing panic in the United States and perhaps cluttering up communications channels. This is the air vulnerability situation. If people are reporting spurious flying saucer sightings and the Air Force has their jets running around chasing non-existent objects, when something might be coming, the real thing, the real attack comes and it's being blurred by all these flying saucer reports. So they need to take immediate steps to improve methods of quick identification of objects in the sky. The CIA should begin a special study to determine what fundamental sciences would be involved and make recommendations for further study. While the CIA was trying to get its act together, the Air Force was still collecting saucer sightings. Here you find out that in July there were 782 reports, August 397, September 162. You can see the number of reports per month is going down. And one of these sightings had more than the average effect. 1952, July, Navy warrant officer and chief photographer Delbert Newhouse, with 21 years in the Navy and 2,000 hours, is an aerial photographer. On the 2nd of July, he and his wife were driving through Utah. About 7 miles west of Tremonton, his wife saw some strange-looking objects moving erratically through the sky and pointed them out to her husband. From his ample experience, he knew what ordinary objects looked like in the sky, and these weren't ordinary. Newhouse reported they were circular and looked like two pie pans, one inverted on top of the top one, upside down on top of the lower one. Newhouse hurried to get his camera out in the trunk of his car. During this time, the objects were going away. By the time he got the camera out, they were quite far away. He made images on the film. They made small images on the film with no particular features. Newhouse turned his film over to the Navy for evaluation, and the Air Force also got a chance to look at it. After several weeks of work, the photo analysts ruled out birds, balloons, and other aircraft. No one knew what the objects were. Word of this extraordinary evidence eventually had an impact on Air Force opinion. A reference to the impact of this film isn't in the Air Force file, but it is in the FBI file. Here is one frame of the film. You see these little lights, and they sort of travel along and rotate around each other like they're sometimes they seem to orbit and so on. Air Intelligence advised of another creditable and unexplainable sighting of flying saucers. Air Intelligence still feels flying saucers are optical illusions or other atmospherical phenomena, but some military officials are seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships. And it goes on in this FBI document to summarize the Newhouse sighting. Just as I did, there were 12 to 16 flying objects recorded on the film. Possibility of weather balloons, clouds, and other explainable objects has been completely ruled out. This is all taken right out of the FBI document.
Actually, that is not completely a correct statement. There have been recent studies of that film done that some claim conclusively, and of course everybody has a different interpretation, but that was simply a flock of birds that was filmed with a background of the sun. So that comment that it completely can't be anything else simply isn't correct.
This is the statement at the time, okay? And as far as the bird's hypothesis is concerned, this statement was presented without Newhouse's verbal description. He and his wife saw these things before he got his camera going. So what happened was they saw the objects, and I gave the description to Newhouse, and Newhouse's interviewed an interview of Newhouse on a film called UFO that was done in 1955 or 56, where Newhouse describes what they looked like when they were close enough to see the detail. So if you're going to argue that this film shows birds, you have to imagine either Newhouse filmed something that he didn't see, it wasn't what he looked at, it wasn't the original reason for stopping the car, getting the camera out and filming, or else it was some sort of a hoax by Newhouse who made up the story.
No, there's a third possibility, Dr. Maccabee, and I take exception to your use of that argument there. The fact is that when you observe aerial phenomena, since there is no scale, it's very difficult to come through with an accurate observation. I think you'll agree that any number of airline captains and so forth, even though they're telling the truth and they're describing accurately what they saw, it's very difficult to describe aerial phenomena. And I think it's probably important, especially with the increase in technology that's available today, to take a look at the film. I understand what you're saying, and from what I've seen, he's a very credible witness.
Yeah.
Just because you're credible doesn't mean that you're accurate, unfortunately.
Well, he saw something which was sufficiently unusual in the details that he could see as an experienced aerial photographer, that made him stop the car and get his camera out, take the time to load up the film, and take the film as far, that he could take. And the fact is that it was studied for, I don't know, Arthur Lundell estimated 1,000 hours or something like that, a person of man-hour time at the Naval Photo Interpretation Center, and in 1952, and nobody could figure out what it was. And so that the status of this film at the time was, it was unexplainable. And according to the document, the Air Technical Intelligence Center was at a complete loss to explain this most creditable sighting. Air Technical Intelligence experts pointed out that they could not be optical illusions, inasmuch as optical illusions could not be recorded on the film. Colonel Young advised that Air Intelligence still feels the so-called flying saucers are either optical illusions or atmospheric phenomena. However, again, some military officials are seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships. Now, this film analysis circulated throughout the intelligence agencies during the following months, July, August, September, and so on. On December 2nd, Chadwell the CIA was aware of this film. Chadwell wrote, the CIA received a further briefing from the Air Intelligence Center on the 25th of November, and at this time, reports of incidents convince us there is something going on that must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such a nature they are not attributable to natural phenomena of known types of aerial vehicles. One thing I didn't get a chance to mention was, for example, the sightings, as I said, were still going along at a high rate, and the Operation Main Brace sightings in October, I believe they were, of 1952. This is during a naval military exercise in the North Sea, I think it was, where some objects were seen flying by the Navy ships and photographed, but information never really was released on that. There was testimony on what happened, but somebody has better information than we have on the Operation Main Brace sightings. Anyway, he recommended a consulting group of sufficient competence and stature to review the matter. Project Blue Book and the Air Force Intelligence and the Intelligence Advisory Committee concurred, and this was the inception of what's been called the Robertson Panel. During December, Project Blue Book prepared to present the best available UFO evidence to the review panel to be held in January of '53. Project Blue Book was limited in time and prepared about 24 of the best reports. By this time, apparently some of the Project Blue Book staff, Ruppelt and Dewey Fournay, were also seriously considering the possibility of that unidentifiable saucers were interplanetary, which is a reversal of the opinion presented to the CIA during the summer of 1952. So in other words, it looks like the Project Blue Book staff was beginning to rethink the situation. And now we have the Robertson Panel, January 14th to 17th, which is basically you get a lot of well-known, famous scientists together who know virtually nothing about the flying saucer subject except what they've been reading in the newspapers, and ask them to come up with a conclusion as to what's going on based on what Project Blue Book was able to tell them. Now, Project Blue Book couldn't bring any hard evidence. They did bring this Newhouse movie and another one from Tremonton, Utah, that had been taken in 1950, and some radar visual sightings and so on. And apparently took the attitude that they were trying to convince the CIA panel there were unexplainable sightings and that ET was a potential explanation. Despite the excellent analysis by the Project Blue Book staff, the panel of scientists, after a few hours of study, concluded, as some hours spread over 3 days, not everybody was there for the whole period of time. Reasonable explanations could be suggested for most sightings, and by deduction and scientific method could be induced, given additional data, that the other sightings might be explained in a similar manner. So because you can explain a lot of them, probably could explain all of them. Is that logical? Is that statistical? Or is that just a guess? Example of reasonable explanation. The Newhouse film objects were explained as we've already been told. Seagulls was the explanation that these people came up with. Well, there were bright spots moving around, and there are seagulls in Utah, and so maybe he films Utah seagulls. They were not told what Newhouse's testimony was. They figured that once you got the film, that's the hard data. You don't need what the guy says about it. If there's one thing you learn in UFO investigation, you've got to put the whole thing together. A photo or a film does not make a UFO. You've got to have some context, some background to what's going on. And Newhouse was very clear about the fact that he stopped because he saw these things looking like, you know, a saucer, saucer inverted on top of another one. The shape is what got him after just several thousand hours of experience. This was not something that he had seen before, so he gets his camera out and takes a film. It's unfortunate the objects are too far away to give you any detail when he actually gets the camera going. According to the analysis at the time, showed the images were too bright to be reflections of birds. The visual sighting by Newhouse and his wife of pie pan-like objects before he started film was not even mentioned. So in 3 days, the panel members did not get the full picture of the 5-year phenomenon that had generated thousands of reports. Their conclusions were based on a lack of information, a lack of understanding, combined with natural bias against anything unusual that wouldn't fit into their scientific worldview. Example of a faulty conclusion based on insufficient information. Dr. Thornton Page, one of the panelists, argued that saucers couldn't be interplanetary craft because such craft would appear all over the world, not just in the USA. Very logical. What the CIA didn't tell him was they had been collecting flying saucer reports from all over the world since 1947. So, Robertson panel conclusion was, even though saucers are not real, reports of saucers could have serious consequences. An enemy during attack could use an existing saucer flap or create one with balloons or other devices to swamp the communications channels with reports. An enemy could use saucer reports and saucer-like devices as decoys for the actual attacking aircraft. The panel recommended stripping the saucers of their special status and starting a program of education and debunking or explaining so the general public would be better able to identify normal aerial phenomena, objects and phenomena. The panel believed that once the subject had been sufficiently debunked, the general public would believe that all the sightings had been explained, and so there would be less interest in reporting. So if you want to get rid of sightings, that's what you do. You tell everybody that there's nothing to it, there's no real point in reporting. You know, if you see something, if you see a flying saucer out there, I don't care if there's a guy standing on it waving at you, you look the other way because it's not real. After the Robertson panel, the CIA decided not to recommend a national security directive to study saucers. That had been a potential possibility the CIA would stand up its own well-funded group to study the subject. After the Robertson panel, they decided against it. CIA basically, as far as the records are available, the CIA lost interest in UFO problem. And after the Robertson panel, Project Blue Book, and after Edward Ruppelt left within the following 6 or 8 months, Project Blue Book went back to just plain classifying sightings and did hardly any investigation. Very rarely did they actually go someplace and talk to a witness. The legacy of the Robertson panel is debunking. The panel recommendation that all sightings can be explained or debunked. Now, this is taken on a nasty connotation, the term debunking. Debunking is getting rid of bunk, okay? Stuff that's false. Everybody likes to do that. Sometimes you have to debunk the skeptics as well as you have to debunk the believers. Naturally, we want to explain everything we can. The problem comes when you start publicizing explanations which make no sense, and in particular explanations that couldn't possibly be right. Now, take the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which is a paradigm type of setter. The first sighting that was widely reported. It's a one-person sighting. The guy in his airplane had plenty of time to look at these things, several minutes. He timed their flight. He saw them with respect to objects in the distance. He got an impression of how big they were, their shape, and so on. There have been, I think it's 7 different explanations offered, starting with ordinary aircraft that were much closer than Arnold thought, and most recently being pelicans. And in between, you've got meteors, and you've got atmospheric phenomena, and so on. Maccabee's first rule of debunking is, any explanation is better than none. My second rule is, if the first explanation doesn't seem convincing, try another one. There's a corollary to the second rule. If the second explanation doesn't seem convincing, try a third. And you keep working your way down, and that's okay if this is a scientific process going on, you're rejecting explanations. But when you publicize each one, like in the New Zealand sightings, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of those, but back in 1978, sightings off the coast of New Zealand involving people flying on an airplane. They took film, color movie film of it and so on, and made a big splash down really around the whole world because a news crew was involved. And the first explanation out of the pike was, it must be the planet Venus. This was from an astronomer in Christchurch, New Zealand. On the same day that this sighting was reported, the newspaper headline was, "People see the planet Venus," and then they described the sighting down below. Turned out the planet Venus rose 2 hours after the sighting. Well, it wasn't the planet Venus. The next day, the astronomer says, "I think it was the planet Jupiter." Well, Jupiter was overhead at the time. Problem, the guy filming couldn't film up through the ceiling of the aircraft to film Jupiter. And with a 200 millimeter focal length lens, he couldn't get images that were as big as were on the film. Anyway, he couldn't, even if he had set up and tried to film Jupiter. So, you know, the guy was shooting from the hip. This is what I call debunking. For the same sightings, Sir Bernard Lovell of the Green Bank Radio Observatory in England was publicized as saying it was all unburned meteorites. Well, the term itself doesn't make much sense, but they saw these things the sightings lasted for many minutes, and the objects didn't go streaking along like meteors. It made no sense. There was also a sighting, the explanation in the newspaper, light reflected off of the breasts of mating mutton birds. They must have been flying upside down. The mutton birds fly at 10,000 feet, and the airplane was like 14,000. Nobody said where the light came from that could have been reflecting. Anyway, so oh wait, I went backwards. Okay, so anyway, here's a summary. 1952 began in a hopeful manner with the Air Force treating the UFO problem seriously and even considering the interplanetary explanation. That came out in the Life magazine article. The huge flap, 2018 reports of 1,501 objects, that's according to the Special Report 14 analysis that was done years after, caused reevaluations and cover-up. By the end of the year, Project Blue Book was convinced, but couldn't convince the panel of scientists. The CIA lost interest after everything was explained by the Robertson panel. The UFO tradition was established and the cover-up lid was on. UFOs never again achieved the high level of interest attained during the year of the UFO. And if you go and you look through the newspapers, it's just mind-boggling what was happening around everybody, and they all had their blinders on. I couldn't see. Before retiring, Ruppelt and the Project Blue Book staff briefed the Air Defense Command January 23, 1953. So this is after the Robertson panel. So this is what Project Blue Book was saying after the Robertson panel. Project Blue Book contradicted the Robertson panel opinion that all sightings could be explained. Project Blue Book reported to the Air Defense Command. Of about 1,000 reports received through military channels in 1952, only 11% could be positively identified. Positively, and we absolutely know what those were. This guy sees a thing up there and we know that there was a balloon there. Oh yeah, he was looking at the balloon. The remaining sightings were labeled as probably identified, 17%, possibly identified, 29%, indeterminate, 23%. Now notice, that's all the possible, probable, likely explanations, and the ones that are indeterminate, there's not enough information or self-consistency, we can't be sure. Then there's still 20% unknown. So after you've separated out what we call the insufficient information cases, you still have stuff that's left over. The legacy of 1952, the UFO tradition. UFO sightings never again achieved the high level of interest that occurred during the summer of 1952, and the tradition that all UFO reports are explainable, none are ET, none represent a threat to the United States, was established. Here's a statistical summary. For 1952, 1947 to 52, and 47 to 69, for those of you who are interested in statistics. This is based on the Special Report 14 data for 47 to 52, and Project Blue Book file that was released in 1969. 1952, you had 1,050 objects, insufficient information that were known, 148 insufficient information, 303 that were unknown. There's your 20%. 47 to 52, 1,525 known, 240 insufficient information, 434 unknown. There's your 20%. Now, at 47 to 69, you have the known plus the insufficient information. You see, they take the insufficient information cases and combine them with the knowns and say that we've explained all these. So you don't have something broken out special as insufficient information, this II right here. You have 11,917 knowns, 701 unknowns, out of a total of 12,618. That's 5.5%. And I remember, you may remember, I said, that's about the hardcore. That's what Colonel Boyd told the FBI in 1952. There's a couple of percent, you know, and Colonel Smith's memorandum that Samford used to put on his press conference, the memorandum said there were 53 sightings out of 1,000 that they had collected at that time that were by these creditable people type of reports. That's the hardcore, folks. There's something going on. So I guess I'll take any questions as long as people want to stay here. I don't know how the time is going. Yes.
I hope you'll indulge me in my exercise of the Maccabee debunking technique here.
Okay.
And by the way, regarding the Newhouse case, there's an interesting photo on the Skeptical Inquirer website. I invite everybody to take a look at it. I think you'll find it fascinating. Everybody can make their own interpretation of it. Just to get a baseline, I was interested in what field and from what school your postgraduate degree came.
What field and what school? American University, Washington, D.C., 1970. Thermodynamics and statistical physics, and use of lasers and critical phenomena.
A question for you, sir. Isn't it true that radars, especially in the early or late 40s, early 50s, because it was a fairly new technology, had a lot of false positives, if you will?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay, so that's a fair statement. And then I guess the other question would be that a lot of UFOs sightings come in flaps, do they not? There seems to be like a cluster, and then they'll gradually dwindle down until there's another flap. Is that a fair statement?
Certainly the sighting rate goes up and down, yes.
Okay. Is that attributable to some of the same, for instance, when there were sightings of aerial ships in the 1800s and witches in the 1600s, is that a large part of it? Is it a result of people becoming aware of these things and therefore being a little more sensitive to the sightings themselves? Or do you think that they are actually just large influx of that phenomenon and then they gradually disappear?
Well, I haven't made a careful study of the 1897 wave that you're talking about, that you mentioned. From what I have read about it, I gather that sightings sort of popped up around the country, and there'd be local reports, not national reports. So it's like something happens over here, the guys over here don't know about it. Later on, they report that something happens over here. Turns out that when you go back years later and you combine these two things, there's some sort of a similarity going on. If you go and read a lot of the newspaper reports from the 1897 wave, I gather, because it's not something that I've studied, that you get the impression that something was going on. We don't know what exactly. When it comes to the UFO situation, as I mentioned, there were sightings before Kenneth Arnold's sighting was publicized. It wasn't until Kenneth Arnold's sighting that people suddenly took this as some sort of thing that's going on, and the Air Force is interested and other people are interested in hearing about it. We know that in April of 1947, there were a couple of sightings by meteorologists in Richmond, Virginia. And one guy said, you know, well, I saw this round silvery object flying along, and I looked at it through my theodolite, and I could see it moving. And he made his report in July. This is after the publicity. He says, I didn't know anybody was interested in it, so I didn't tell anybody. There were several pilot sightings in May and June that preceded Kenneth Arnold's. So you can ask, you know, why was this big flap? Was this big flap real phenomenon going on, or was it a situation that Kenneth Arnold's sighting suddenly alerted everybody and people go outside and they see all sorts of stuff and report it?
Does it still happen that way today, though? Don't they still tend to happen in flaps where there's a huge influx of sightings and then they tend to dissipate and so forth? And I can understand that there are going to be reports around the perimeter.
Yeah.
But
The problem is, the closest you could get to making up statistics on that sort, because you're asking a sort of a statistical type of question, would be to go to the National UFO Reporting Center files and look at what's happened over the last 5 or 10 years, which is not something that I have done. We don't have the Air Force. We don't have a publicly known group that's collecting stuff in sort of a more or less uniform manner over years that we can build up this statistics. There certainly have been clusters of sightings that occur in areas. Some area will suddenly have a cluster of sightings. In 1952, this may have been a worldwide event. We're not sure because it's hard to get newspapers in the foreign languages. We know sightings were occurring overseas that were picked up by American intelligence. Certainly things were happening throughout the United States. I showed you it was a geography lesson on July 20, 24-hour period or 48-hour period it was in latter July, where we had, 51 different reports from 24 states or something like that. That was a macroscopic, large area flap. Seems like in recent years what we've been more likely to have is small areas where there'd be a concentration of sightings in a small area, then that goes away, and some other area, a concentration pops up.
Is any of it attributable to media reports, or do you think it's all?
Usually, you have no media report until the first one.
I'd like
Now,
to
it's hard. It's always hard to decide. You know, is that first one generating then a whole bunch of spurious reports? Was the first one real? Consider, for example, a January 2000, I think it was, Ohio police report that made national news. Early January, I think it was, where the Ohio police reported seeing a triangular object flying through the sky in southwestern Ohio and in Indiana, was it? This did make national news because police officers were involved. But that didn't suddenly generate a big flap of sightings. The sighting rate just continued along. Sort of
I'd like to add to this discussion that there's a third force or an intention involved here that escapes the statistical discussion that's taking place here. If we look at the situation that took place in Mexico, where a solar eclipse was going to happen, and many people were prepared to videotape and photograph this natural phenomenon that was
Yes.
scheduled to happen. It was reported that many people had profound close sightings of anomalous flying objects. And it so much so that it suggested to me that whoever it was that was navigating those objects took the opportunity to show themselves at a time when so many people were out there and prepared to record them.
That's pure conjecture, isn't it?
Isn't it wonderful?
I understand, but absence of evidence is not proof of
Yeah.
existence.
But in that situation, you're confronted with the fact that there were a lot of videos that were showing things up in the sky that people didn't expect. Yeah, there was a lot of them that showed the solar eclipse. But there were videos that showed something, and so you'd be confronted with explaining, you know, why did that happen? Or explaining each case, and, you know, this was birds, that was balloons, there was somebody who was flying through the area at the time in a strange airplane, and that was videotaped. That is some sort of hard evidence that something occurred. And so it's not just a case of what you had been talking about before, more or less verbal reports that pop up and down. The situation, the Phoenix Lights was at the time of that comet, Hale-Bopp. A lot of people were out there in Phoenix and other places, you know, looking around. And the first event that happened that evening was this object that is reported flying from, someplace 50 miles north of Phoenix, flying southward over the state and then over Phoenix itself. The second part, which I split off from the first part, that occurred at 10 o'clock with the videos, you can go to my website and find a big analysis on that about, I think that was flares. But whatever happened between 8 and 9 p.m., seen by apparently hundreds of witnesses, is this big dark triangular thing flying over. I talked to a retired Air Force colonel, I believe he was, who said that he saw it fly over. That would have been, that's what I would consider a real UFO. No, I don't think anybody's explained that.
And then the attempts on the part of the Air Force to confuse and obfuscate the phenomenon by putting on a show, a flare show, that suggests to me a consistency with their policy since the 50s of trying to obscure and suppress this subject.
Yeah, I can't.
I think they do it to this day in those ways.
Personally, I don't think that the flare drop what I call a flare drop, and the guy who spoke here earlier, Bill Hamilton, disputes that, but I did the triangulation, which shows that they were 60 miles away. Anyway, I can't say that the flare drop was a response to the 8 to 9 event. In other words, that the Air Force intentionally tried to cover it up. I think in that situation, it was probably a pre-planned event. And then you could argue in the other direction, the guys who flew the triangles knew that it was okay to fly it because the Air Force was going to do something later on that was going to cover them up. You make all sorts of weird speculation, yes.
Either way, I would agree with you.
Things that I think are pretty significant with these statistics as far as historical and the increase in sightings or reported sightings. It's just a matter of distribution of information has increased, and population of people have also gotten heads from being on the ground all day long working, sleeping at night. So we got a lot more people with a lot more leisure time. Anyway. The really significant thing in 1947, obviously, we're new into playing around with powers that certainly cause us to turn into a pretty lonely planet surface. So I think it's pretty significant. Another thing, I think a lot of people focus too much on the physical existence of these things, not to say they're not physical, but I think we've come so far along now with some of the research, like what's his name, Cockpit, the theoretical, where these guys are coming so close to getting, really close to unified field theory that, forget about, planetary things. We're talking time and space, which just doesn't make sense. We're talking, I think that a lot of this stuff can be explained by manipulation of time, space, as opposed to getting some big rockets or energy source and, pushing things. I think it's a much different level. And so we're a very interesting study. Let's just see what's going to happen. I think we're a very interesting study. So, yeah. That's something.
I was very interested in your remark about, in fact, going back to 1952, that there were some who assumed interplanetary phenomena based on the deduction that it's nothing that we could do, nothing we nor the Russians could not build something that could perform in that way. And assuming, since there were people like that back in 1952, obviously those people would want to learn and figure out how craft of this sort could be made, could be built. I'd be very interested in any knowledge you have as a physicist of people who may have been pursuing this way of building things.
There's nothing in the documentation that tells you who might have been actively investigating new and novel means of transportation. Okay, we know some of the people who were actually working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the time, and we know, for example, in 1947 when this all began, there was immediate interest in the fact that these things were described as being semicircular or circular, according to, like for example, in the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And the reason was they had already been considering the possibility of making a mono-wing type of aircraft in a sort of a semicircular manner. And a guy by the name of Arthur Ledding, who was one of the top aeronautical guys there, had, I guess, investigated model type things that had a circular front end. And so you can well imagine if they're thinking theoretically about this stuff. Could we fly? This is conventional propulsion techniques, which are based on explosions. You know, everything that virtually everything that moves out there by itself is based on explosions. If you're not using batteries and electricity, you're using controlled explosions to move yourself. And one can imagine that when Ledding and the other people at Wright Field at the time saw these flying saucer sightings, the first thing they would think of is, well, our ideas are correct. Somebody has done it already.
Some people say 50% of solving any problem is knowing it can be done. Sure.
Yeah.
Like the Russians knowing that the atomic bomb could be made because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So assuming
What the hell's
these
wrong?
people in the Air Force, assuming interplanetary, must then think in terms of propulsion or
Right.
energy.
One of the first propulsion
Different than
One of the first propulsion things that they considered was that this was atomic energy aircraft. Now we had our own project to build aircraft that were propelled by atomic energy. The Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft project, headquartered at Oak Ridge, and I will be talking a little bit about that because it enters into the FBI stuff in my FBI lecture. The FBI was told that the existence of flying saucers had given an impetus to our own project to create an atomic energy aircraft, because that was the only power source they could imagine that could have these things flying around at such high speed, you know, and be sufficiently different from the ordinary either propellers or rockets that, you know, jet engines that we were accustomed to. That was back in the old days, you know. In the 1950s, there were also people trying to do more esoteric propulsion, having to do based on electromagnetic theory. And if you jump ahead 50 years to within the last 5 or 6 years, you know, people are trying to relate that to things like 0-point fluctuations. You know, the thought now is that the universe has a substrate, which in the old days might have been called the ether. Nowadays it has a different name. Nobody knows exactly what it is. Particles pop in and out of the so-called false vacuum. You take away everything, all the atoms and all the molecules and all the electrons and protons and neutrons, and you have a space with absolutely no matter in it. Can you do that? Probably not, but if you could, presumably there'd be nothing there. But in fact, if you look very carefully with a quantum microscope, you can see particles popping in and out of existence. And so you can sort of imagine our existence. Imagine a big ocean of water. And we're little ripples on that ocean. Nowadays we say that something like 75% of any particular volume of the universe, 75% of it is...
electromagnetic.
Huh?
Beside the electromagnetic, you would have to have a source of energy in the craft itself that would have to be enormous. Were there any people, any traces of people in 52 who would then follow up? I mean, think of people like Von Braun.
Yeah, they were deeply embedded in conventional rockets.
They're deeply embedded in what?
In conventional rockets. You mentioned von Braun.
Yeah.
People didn't have enough, and we probably still don't have enough, but at least back in those days, they didn't have enough physical understanding of the universe to
Well, I just gave
approach.
him as another. What about other people?
Yeah, well, I don't know. They said there's nothing in the documentation that shows who was doing that sort of stuff. All we can do is speculate as to who might have been trying to think many years ahead, or you go and you read the scientific literature or the science fiction literature or whatever.
What about companies like Lockheed Martin?
They had, I mentioned that there were several companies, I think Boeing was one of them, that was looking into the electromagnetic stuff based on Townsend-Brown effect and so on. Nobody was able to make it work. That doesn't mean that it won't work somehow in the future. What I was trying to say earlier, though, was 75% of the universe is what we now call dark energy. 25% of it is, about 20% is dark matter, and 5% is what we are.
I find it really interesting that what nobody seems to talk about is what I started to type while you were back here, that the Germans actually flew a saucer aircraft back in 45 in that area. And I've interviewed prisoners of war that were there and saw it, and they crashed it. But after the war, most of the scientists came here, so I suspect that somewhere our government or somebody's using that. So when
Yeah.
the plasma type engine is used, mechanical oscillator to move magnets to create a plasma anti-gravity type effect. And it's being duplicated across the United States by individuals now, proving that it works. But the government doesn't seem interested, so I figure they must already know about it.
You're talking about the lifter things that's going on?
Now, this is about the project that the VNA David Campbell from Ontario.
Oh, yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
There's other places, he gives the information away how to build this. He'll talk to anybody who wants to talk to him. He thinks it should be out there. And there's people all across the United States build these, and they actually fly,
Hmm.
and nobody wants to know about
The
it.
problem is, propulsion theories are probably a dime a dozen. They've been going on ever since 1952, and they've been set up in the last 10 years now. NASA set up this advanced propulsion project, I forget exactly what they call it, for a period of time, and they were looking for new and novel means, and anybody could bring in their stuff and have it tested and so on. So I don't think they found anything that was
What about energy, though? Matter and antimatter battery type?
yeah. Well, how do you get the antimatter? It takes a phenomenal amount of energy to just generate a tiny amount of antimatter.
What about element 116?
It takes a tremendous amount of energy to generate element 116, one atom at a time. Was it 4? Oh, okay.
But maybe there's some way to build it in a stable.
Well, I don't know. There may be. Yes.
The governments of the earth ever find out why 52 was such a poor year for these foreign craft?
That's a good question. You know, why 52? And there was nothing in any documentation that speculated. Remember, the government was trying to argue that this big flap was generated by the article that showed Marilyn Monroe. Right? Marilyn Monroe's on the front of the cover. Everybody read that. Then they saw on the upper right-hand, there's a case for flying saucer, so everybody walked outside and saw a flying saucer. There's nothing that provides a reasonable, logical suggestion as to why 1952 had this big spike. There was another flap in the United States in 1957 when they,
That year,
what?
was the military doing that, anything that year around the globe? Like in
We were having a,
the
we're,
atom bomb.
I know. We were having the Korean War, but the Korean War had started a couple of years earlier. Hmm? Oh, well, in November of 1952, there was the first H-bomb, but the flap was over by that time.
Maybe they were here for checking out the last of the working on that.
I don't know. I had thought that, you know, if something had really crashed at Roswell, and then they had kept up surveillance over a period of time, that this was a big push to locate wherever it was. Another possibility would be related to the abduction phenomenon, that we only see flying saucers because they're accidentally seen during their abduction operations. That's a hypothesis. And that there were a lot of that type of operation going on during 1952. I don't know. Well, I guess you start at 1:30 or what? 1:30. Yeah.
Is there time for one more question?
Yeah.
Are there any pictures of the lights up the cap authenticated?
there's a photograph of the Washington D.C. Capitol building, which has been published in magazines showing, quote, UFOs. The cameraman was looking into a field of traffic, of street lights. There's a lot of lights there. And there's these little images up in the sky part up above, and as I recall, this is a result of reflections inside the lens. The lens flares, and you can do a geometric relation between each little reflection and the light source itself. So I'm not familiar with any film or photos showing anything over Washington, D.C. area at the time.
What do you think about Ruppelt's about face right before his death?
Oh. The man asked about Ruppelt's about face, sort of, when he wrote his, let's see now, make sure we get the right one here. The second edition of Ruppelt's book contains an extra chapter. He didn't change any of the first few chapters. He got to the end of the first book, and it was like he was sitting right on the fence. Could be real, could be interplanetary, and it wouldn't take much of a feather to knock him over into the interplanetary side. At least that was my impression when I read his book the first time. But then the second edition had another chapter on it, which he sort of poo-pooed the whole thing. And the question is, why did he do that? Did he change his opinion? I think there may well have been some pressure applied to him, but he may also have changed his opinion somewhat after having been away from it for several years. This was in 1959, I think, several years after he had left. I don't know, it's not something that I have studied, so I can't say that there's anything specific that you could point to. He did not deny the first part of his book. He just added on stuff that wasn't supportive of the first part. Okay, so it stands up here in about 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, whatever.
Thank you. I'd like to get you the